some of the people here, many of the people here in the room, have benefited from the great workshops that your center puts on. Today, she will talk to us about reverse design and its role in curricular and programmatic articulation. Please help me welcome Dr. Baumann.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Angelika. It's great, really lovely to be here and see some familiar faces as well. And I have a lot to share with you, and I really hope that it's very useful. And I really want to make it clear, I'm not here to tell you what to do, not at all. Really more to share a framework and some work that we've done that may be useful to you in thinking about the work you want or need to do. And I know I'm speaking to a group with a lot of experience, broad experience, deep experience, long experience. So really, I just hope to offer some frameworks and some examples of the work we've done at Chicago. If you have questions, I'm very, very happy to take questions during the talk. It doesn't have to wait to the end. Also, if they come through on the chat, Samuel, it's sometimes best to take the question at the moment when it's being talked about in the talk. So I want to start with some of the what I'm calling hard news. I don't want to call it bad news, but difficult news and the world of language and humanities study that we're facing and looking ahead. And you may know some of this. I have to click somewhere else. So that is the trends in enrollment. So this is the MLA data that many of you may be familiar with, peaking in sort of 2005, 2009, I think. And I would add, this is what Chicago's enrollments also look like. Our enrollments seem to be very flat, although our undergraduate college has almost tripled since the time I started at the university in 1999. So even though our enrollments seem kind of flat, they've actually decreased substantially. In 2005, one of every two students was taking a language class at some point, and now it's dropped by half of that, one in every 4 or 5. In addition to that, we have, this is an article, kind of a, not really humorous, not for us, of course, humorous article from the Washington Post about the general decrease in humanities degrees in general, taking a precipitous plunge, crisscrossing here with computer science, and I'm assuming humanities continuing on the decline and computer science and other STEM fields on the incline. This is data from the Department of Education. This is just the numbers of students entering higher ed, deciding to go to college. You can see that in 2018, it started to drop. This is pre-COVID. Keep in mind that continued in 2019. And now you see the big drop in 2021. 1 million students stepped out of, either didn't enter or stepped out of college for all kinds of reasons. And we're still living in the aftermath of that. And this will probably also continue. And if all of this were not enough, we have this data. This is based on census data that since 2007, the birth rate in the United States is dropping and continues to drop. They're predicting starting in about 2005. So it started in 2007, which means in 2005, the number of 18-year-olds will drop. And that will continue. They're talking about a 20% drop of 18 to 24-year-olds beginning in about 2025 and continuing. So we're really seeing a completely changed landscape, even in factors for which we have no control. And one final bit of data, and this is a really interesting monograph, if you can get a hold of it, about the Gen Z, the kids. And I know in the last 8 to 10 years on my campus, some of us who have been around for a while have said the students have changed, and they have changed. So the students born starting around 1997, some say 95, some say 98, they have a very, very different view of higher ed. They were teenagers, young teenagers during the economic crash in 2008, and they saw these really dire things happen to their families. Families lost their homes, parents lost their retirement income. These kids see college as a path to a career. That makes sense in terms of the STEM increase in STEM majors. They're very financially conservative. They don't want to go into debt. And they also now, as young adults, they see all these shenanigans around student loans playing out in the press almost every day. They're very, very skeptical about whether what they learn in college is going to be useful to them later in life. That's what they want. That's what they're asking for. And their top reason to go to college is to get a better job. So in this context, which is already with us and probably going to get even more sort of severe, I do think as a language teacher, we do have something to offer these students. I firmly believe we are teaching them something that meets all of these criteria. We are teaching them something that will bring them, and I hate to use the expression, the so-called return on investment. We are teaching them something that's going to enhance their career opportunities, that's going to be useful to them later in life. That's a real world skill. I do firmly believe we're doing that. And that is, of course, proficiency in another language other than English, right? And so I want to spend just a little time talking specifically about maybe revisiting or refreshing, maybe rehabilitating the idea of language proficiency, because that is the thing I think we really can promise these students. So just to briefly revisit the idea of language proficiency, I like to use the metaphor of learning to drive. So when you learn to drive, you did two different things. You learned the rules of the road. You learned what the stop signs mean. You read a manual or did work online. And after you learned all that stuff, you took a test, which was a written test or a computer test, most usually a multiple choice test on the rules of the road, right? That is an achievement test also. It tests what you know about driving, okay? It's important. You need to know that stuff in order to drive. But would you get into a car with someone who knew the history of cars, the name of everything on the car and how to fix a car, but had never driven a car? Okay, so that's the other part of learning to drive. You take the car out and drive. You learn to do stop signs. You learn to do parallel parking. You learn to turn left. You learn to turn right. And at the end of that, you take a driving test. That's a proficiency test, right? This is what we need to do with language. We need to teach students, our students, about the language, and we need to test them about their knowledge of the language, but we also need to let them drive the car. We need to let them use language in the classroom in activities that we design, and we need to test that. We need to do both. And especially responding to these Gen Z students, these new students, if we're promising them language proficiency, if we're promising them real world skills, we have to teach them real world skills. We have to let them use language in the way they're going to use it in the real world, and we have to test it. And I want to make it clear, I'm not talking about no longer teaching about language and no longer testing. We have to do both if we want to meet the needs of these students. And so that's what teaching and testing for proficiency, small p or capital P if you want, means. It means that we are promising our learners, we are providing them with real world skills. And these are some additional arguments to that. So first of all, I think that teaching students so that they gain real world skills is also reflects our goals, right? So we don't say to just like when I was the director of the German language program, I didn't say to those students, come learn German, it's great. It has 4 different cases and 3 genders. You're gonna love it. This was not my argument for learning German. My argument for learning German was, come learn German. You will have access into this amazing culture, this amazing place with this history, and where you can engage with these people and this world. That's what you'll get when you learn German. And so if that's our outward face, we should be teaching toward those goals and testing whether our students are reaching those goals. And that's a promise. to our students, and it's an important promise to these students coming into our institutions now. This is also what our students are doing with language. Many of our students are already using language to inform or to work in other places, other worlds, engage with other communities of scholars and experts. So they're already out there doing that. And furthermore, teaching and testing for proficiency really lets us connect what we're doing in the classroom to real world language use, really connect those dots for these students. And also, if you're using proficiency outcomes, you can talk to them about what they can do with language at the end of a year of instruction. I could say to my German students, if you take a year of German, you can function. When you go over to Germany, you can function as a tourist. You can get around, you can talk to people, ask questions, and do what you need to do. I could tell them that with some level of confidence and assurance. And it also is making it very clear that learning about another language and culture is something our students will take out into the world with them when they leave us, when they leave our classrooms. And again, to just clarify or revisit, I do want to clarify some things about the proficiency guidelines, which we do use in our reverse design approach, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But in work with a lot of campuses, I found there are a lot of sort of beliefs and residual, I don't know what the word would be, about the guidelines that I think are the result of when they were introduced in the 80s and even early 90s. And I do want to clarify that. So what are the guidelines, the ACTFL proficiency guidelines? They are this, and this is taken right from the first page of the guidelines document. Descriptions of what individuals can do with language in the 4 skills in the real world, in real world situations, spontaneously and non-rehearsed. If you drop them, if I teach German for a year, or we teach Korean for a year, and you drop them into the middle of a place where that language is spoken, what can they do unrehearsed, right? And it's an instrument for evaluation. Okay, what are the guidelines not, right? They are not based on any method, on any theory, or any curriculum. There's no such thing as a proficiency curriculum. It doesn't exist. Obviously, communicative language teaching is in harmony with proficiency outcomes and proficiency assessment, but there's no such thing as a proficiency method, right? The method is up to you, really. The guidelines are also not a description of how someone learns language, nor are they a curriculum. They're also not an emphasis on speaking. The speaking proficiency guidelines hit the field first I think the provisional guidelines were published in 1982, and the reading, writing, and speaking guidelines were created and published after that. But this does not mean that proficiency is limited to speaking. Obviously, when I drop my students into Dusseldorf at the end of a year, they're reading, writing, speaking, and listening German, not just speaking it. And it's also, the guidelines are also not an endorsement to not teach grammar. I think because in the proficiency interview, we recognize that intermediate students, intermediate level speakers make errors. It's part of the description. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be teaching them grammar. It means that even if we teach them grammar and practice grammar and drill grammar and test grammar, which we do, an intermediate is still going to make errors because they don't have full control of the grammar. So it recognized what intermediates can do with language. And this really, if you go look way back to Larry Selinker's article in 1972 on interlanguage, was exactly what he was saying. Listen to what the speakers can do. It gives you evidence of how well they have control of rules. Okay, I want to turn now to the reverse design model that has evolved on our campus. It really evolved over time with 2 out of a model by Wiggins and Mateague, which is one source, but backward or reverse design has been around since the 50s and 60s when outcome-based education hit the field. I was studying elementary education in the 1970s, and already learning outcomes, testing learning outcomes was very well established. But the way I like to open up the concept of reverse design, and by the way, we use the term reverse design instead of backward design because it resonates with the idea of reverse engineering instruction from outcomes. So I like to ask a group like this one, what's the best way to get there? Should I take a bus or walk? What's the best way? Why can't you tell me? Where am I going? If you don't know where I'm going, it's very hard to tell me how to get there, right? And that is the very premise of reverse design or backward design. You need to know your destination to make choices about how to get there. That's the whole premise of the entire concept. So this is our model, and actually I'm going to, it's not a handout, let me do that, thanks. And I'm going to teach it, basically, just introduce it, I would say, and also point out how it is distinct from other reverse design models. So first of all, we start with the target language use domain, which is language use in the real world. And I think I've already made an argument for that we are prepared, we want to make an argument to our students, we are preparing them to use language in the real world. I'm not just teaching first-year German to prepare them to take second-year German. I mean, I am, because of my program should be articulating, but that's not my real goal, and that's not how I get them into my classroom. I'm teaching them so they can use language in the real world. That's the first part. What are they going to be able to do with language in the real world? That's my preparation. The next component is called the construct in assessment, and that is how you describe what they can do and how well they can do it. And we at Chicago use the ACTFL guidelines as our construct. We draw on the ACTFL guidelines to identify outcomes for 1 year of instruction, 2 years of instruction, 3 years of instruction. Why do we use the guidelines? They've been around for almost 50 years. They've been validated. They work. Are they perfect? No. But as I said, they have been validated. And if we weren't going to use the guidelines, if we wanted to use our own descriptions, we'd have to identify them, we'd have to test them, we'd have to research them, we'd have to validate them, and that would take 4 or 5 years. So we're using what's available. And if another question is why not use the Common European Framework, that's a whole other kind of question, which I could answer, but I think I'm going to run out of time. So next is operationalization. All right, and this is really where we make a distinction and where this approach is distinct. But we have operationalization is the point where you take your construct, say intermediate low speaking, and you create a test task that tests it. There are a lot of ways to test intermediate speaking, and we are very, very precise about those kinds of test tasks. They're performance-based tasks. And also the way you operationalize a skill sends a message to your learners about what the skill is and how to prepare for it, right? Something distinct in this model is we do this with our participants. We assume language use in the real world. Our participants identify the outcomes for their language with the knowledge, what they know is possible in their language at their institution. It's different all over the place. We have our participants design their own tests. So very often people use external tests. We insist on having the participants design their own tests to test the construct from the ACTFL guidelines. And in reverse design, only when all of this is in place, your target language use domain, your ACTFL outcomes, your 4 skills proficiency test, when all of this is in place, do we turn to the curriculum and say, how am I teaching? What am I teaching? What might I need to change? will my curriculum prepare my students to be successful on my test and give me the evidence to show that they are performing at the levels that are my goals, my outcomes. Okay, that's the model. So all this comes first, and only at the end, only then do you consider your curriculum. Okay? Questions, comments here? All right. We have a lot of test development going on, and your colleagues who have been in our workshops can tell you about that test design development. And actually, as the result of a lot of this test development going on in our institution, we've created some certifications for our learners. I think, I'll skip here. So here's an example of the practical proficiency certification. And practical proficiency we've defined as being able to function in personal and some professional or academic contexts. Okay. So if any of you know the proficiency levels, what level would that have to be? If there's some performance, some functional ability in professional or academic. Anyone? So you have to hit intermediate high because you have to be up in near the advanced level if you're outside of the personal. All right, that's tied to the ACTFL levels as they're defined. So students can get this certification, they take the test successfully. And what's really nice is on the back of it is a prose description of what they can do in each of the skills. All right. So some advantages to having these proficiency outcomes and testing them. Some things that it tells you about your program. So first of all, I can make decisions about what I'm teaching and how I'm teaching it. I know what I'm headed for, and I know how it's going to be tested. Now, let me back up for a minute. I'm still teaching and doing achievement testing in my chapter tests and quizzes. So these tests are an end of sequence summative assessment, end of first year German, end of second year Arabic, right? They're not chapter tests. Those are different, right? This lets me set outcomes at the end of a year and test them, but it informs how I'm going to teach throughout the year. It lets me see if my learners are actually getting there, right? So if I think that after 2 years of German, my students are all near the intermediate high level in all 4 skills, I actually find out whether or not they are. And that can be a real eye-opener. I get to see if they've reached the outcomes. When I have multi-section courses, as I often did, usually taught by graduate students, and have these end of first year outcomes, my students, my grad students or instructors don't have to all be teaching in exactly the same way. I don't have to script their lesson plans. But the final sort of consistency comes when all the students take the end of first year proficiency test. Are all the students reaching those proficiency levels? Then those differences or minor differences in teaching activities are fine, as long as everyone understands the goal and understands how they're teaching. So it allows for consistency across multiple sections. It also lets me see whether an expectation of intermediate high after the second year is reasonable depending on where my outcomes are at the end of the first year. And I'll show you an example of that in just a second. If I make a change to my curriculum, for example, in one summer where this test was teaching first year in our introductory German, first year German, we had to switch from a 9-week curriculum to a 7-week. We had to compress it into 7 weeks. I gave the same proficiency test. Okay, I was able to see if the students were still reaching the same proficiency levels, and they were. So I could be confident about the changes. I had to compress the curriculum. I had to move more work out of the class, keep some work in class, but I made that big change and still had this independent measure and knew I was still reaching the same proficiency levels. I changed textbooks. When we all went online, some languages said, oh, the students aren't going to be able to do X or aren't going to be able to do Y. The languages that have these end of sequence tests could see. whether there were losses. Would you like to guess which skill suffered in a couple of languages? When we were all teaching virtually, or, listening. I haven't researched this. I think speaking was stayed healthy because the students were so happy to be interacting with each other, even online in a German class or a Spanish class. They were actually communicating in these activities. They were just getting less exposure to the language because they weren't in the classroom, and God only knows what they were doing with those with those cameras on or off. So, but anyway, we had an independent measure to see what was going on there. This informs the structure of the activities I do with students. I know, for example, if I have speaking proficiency level, I have to give them time to talk to each other in class. I have to prepare them for a end of first year face-to-face test of their speaking. That's my job. That's where I'm accountable. So it affects the activities and the way I structure things when I'm teaching. And it informs the kinds of formative assessments, right? So if I know I'm going to give all my students, or all my instructors are going to give my students, a short sort of limited OPI at the end of the first year, I have to give them opportunities to have a face-to-face conversation or test with that instructor during the whole year. It's not fair to confront them with a test format they've never had before and then give them a high stakes test. So I have to build in face-to-face assessment throughout the year so that, number one, they're ready for that format. Number two, I get to see if they're progressing the way I hope they are. Number three, they get to see if they're progressing the way they're supposed to be, which is basically the definition of a formative assessment. It informs the teacher. It also informs the learner of how things are going. And I can tell my students more than just their grade. I can talk about real world skills, and I can think about what needs to happen in my second year curriculum based on what I know they're completing the first year curriculum with. So if I know they're all at the sentence level strongly at the end of first year, I know in the second year I've got to build their ability to connect language, make it more cohesive, make it more fluent, increase vocabulary, and that helps me design my second year curriculum. So I want to go now to some specific examples of how this reverse design approach has helped answer some questions or solve some real curricular problems, curricular questions, curricular challenges. So the first one I want to look at is heritage language programming. We all have probably heritage learners in our classes. Some of my colleagues would say they don't. As anyone who says they don't have any heritage students, or they don't think they have many heritage students, as soon as we do some real outreach, we find out they're everywhere. So, but as you know, finding our heritage learners is one of the biggest challenges of working with them. And you may have read the studies and the research that many heritage learners think we don't want their language skills here in institutions of higher ed. They're not good enough. We don't want them. We don't like what they do, or what they do is riddled with error, or whatever it might be. So one thing we did in our online placement tests is add what we call the heritage question. This question is on every single online placement test at the University of Chicago. It was written by one of our colleagues who's the coordinator of heritage initiatives across all languages. We have now 17 languages up online. Our incoming first-year college students, undergraduates, take their language placement tests online in the summer before they get to us. Even very small languages that don't have many students who have previous knowledge, we've encouraged them to put any kind of placement test up online because it makes their language more visible to the entering students. And everyone has what we call the heritage question. So this signals that we want you, we know you're out there, we want you in our classes. Every single language that's included the heritage question has had an increased number of students taking the placement test, an increase in the number of heritage languages, heritage speakers self-identifying, and increased enrollments. The most, I think in our Korean program, the number of students taking the placement test doubled, and 60% of the students were heritage speakers. So this was a big, a very important finding for her. This is just another example of an article you may have read in this Commission on Language Learning. Heritage speakers are one of the biggest and most wasted resources of language learners in the country. So we want those students. We really want to reach out to them. This is on our website, really just signaling to these students, they have skills that we really want to bring them into our courses, but how to do it. So this is a sort of typical example of how once you start identifying outcomes at ends of language sequences, first, second, third, and testing them, you can begin to articulate your program. So this is no specific language, but you can see end of first year, here are the levels and the 4 skills. Here's the expectations for the end of second year, end of third year, end of fourth year. Okay, and again, you can lay this out, begin testing it, make adjustments. Sometimes things are better, sometimes things are worse. Sometimes you realize, oh my gosh, the listening is very weak. You look at your listening curriculum. What do I need to change, do differently, do more, whatever it might be. So if you want to accommodate your heritage learners, how might you design a course to accommodate them, to bring them in? All right. So if you know this about your language, and you know this about your heritage learners, that they come in with pretty strong speaking, almost no writing, depending on the writing system, strong listening, and very weak reading, okay? If you know this, or you could even test it, then maybe you can design a course that brings them all to the intermediate mid-level, which means they could enter your third year sequence, because you know that at the end of the second year, all your learners are at the intermediate mid-level. So even though there are differences in their profiles, you could conceivably design a course for heritage learners to bring them all to a point where they could join your curriculum here. See what I mean? So knowing these outcomes, knowing these levels helps you do a very specific kind of course design with a specific entry point in mind. You may need a course, you may need a year, right? But this course would focus on literacy skills, right? It wouldn't look the same as a regular beginning course. And the problem is that our heritage learners, they don't belong here because they already have skills beyond those levels, but they don't belong here either. So the question is, what do I need to do to bring them in? And how can I optimally design it? So this kind of course design we've done actually with some online literacy focused courses that we're able to offer in our September term. We don't start till the end of September. And in Korean, Chinese, and Spanish so far, to bring the heritage learners in and get them launched into higher level classes, because they can also reach higher levels of our proficiency certifications because they have fluency. They have the thing that's the hardest for the traditional learners to gain. So this is where this reverse design with outcomes helps you solve that problem or answer that question or think about this kind of course design. Okay, here's another example, our Arabic language program. I shared that practical proficiency certification with you, and most students, most languages, well, I shouldn't say most, Romance and Germanic languages can reach the level of intermediate high where their students are eligible for the practical proficiency certification in about 2 years. And when we started working with the Arabic program, they also wanted their students to be eligible for practical proficiency at the end of 2 years. But what do you see here? So first of all, is it reasonable to get from novice high to intermediate high in a year? I mean, this is where these outcomes help you articulate. But we didn't want to say that to the Arabic program you're never going to get your students to intermediate high in 3 years, because we wanted them to find that out themselves by testing. They created a end of first year test, and they created a practical exam and started trying to give it to their end of second year students. Now, in the midst of this, they also wanted to use a new textbook, and also realized if they were preparing their students for the real world, they needed to do some non-modern standard Arabic listening, because that's what's going to happen in the real world. So our instructor was really struggling with how to get the students here, what textbook to use, how to meet the needs, and include this non-standard language practice. So in a conversation with her, we suggested, maybe at the end of second year, you're here. And suddenly it was literally like a light went on. And she said, oh, right. That means I have time to do the non-standard dialect work with them. This is a more sensible articulation. And also, this was the most wonderful thing she said, and I don't need to teach the whole textbook. It was a very long textbook. She said, I just need to teach the material in that book that's going to get my students to the intermediate mid-level. It was like it broke her away from the textbook being the curriculum. The textbook was no longer the curriculum. The textbook was a tool to help her deliver these outcomes. So this solved this programmatic articulation for her by being able to think about these outcomes and test them, which is still going on. Another example, and this is maybe something you're familiar with, and I think it's also something that happens in the modern languages and commonly taught languages as well. So our Tibetan language program, our colleague, has been working with us and on proficiency for his first and second year, and developed tests and revised his curriculum. But he has faculty waiting to receive his students and wants them prepared to be studying classical Tibetan. And they want this to be happening during the second year. So he's got graduate students primarily in there he's trying to prepare to start studying classical Tibetan, and undergraduates who are political science majors who want to learn how to speak Tibetan because they want to go over and work for an NGO. So basically what's happening is he's meeting the needs of neither of those groups. And this reverse design model lets him make that clear, right? If you think of this model, the target language use domain for those two groups is different. You need a different set of outcomes, a different test, and a different curriculum. So what he finally did was went to his chair and asked that in same curriculum for first and second year, in the third year, undergraduates continue with a 4 skills proficiency oriented curriculum, and grad students begin the study of classical Tibetan, knowing that they have already intermediate mid skills in reading regular Tibetan. And then you split the two groups, this way meeting the needs of both groups. Now, did he get what he wanted? No, not yet. But this model helps him lay it down in very precise, evidence-based terms to his chair. It's not his opinion, it's not his feeling, it's the reality of these two groups using that model. Okay, questions before I turn to, oh good, I'm okay on time. Other LSP, other concerns. So the reverse design model, I do want to turn to language for specific purposes, because I think that's going to be a very, very rich area for us to keep our students with us to higher levels of proficiency. And so by language for specific purposes, I'm talking about language for the professions. And if you're using language in the workplace, this implies the advanced level or close to it, right? Because the advanced level is the place where we start seeing professional language, semi-professional language, limited working proficiency, and professional proficiency. So that's the target language use domain, right? The workplace. That the actual guidelines do not have descriptions of language proficiency in the professions. They have general language proficiency, right? If you want to use a reverse design model to define those skills, you need to do some research on your own. And this is how we're approaching the design of language for the specific LSP courses, is to do domain analyses. All right. So domain analysis is where you research language use in the domain and define what are called the knowledge, skills, and abilities, the KSAs, of what individuals do in that domain. And then you essentially describe and create your own construct. You create your own set of, like a mini set of guidelines. This is what they need to do, and this is how well they need to be able to do it. And then you design a test, and then you design a course. So this is different than, sitting in my office thinking about German for business. First of all, which business? Finance, marketing, advertising, banking, running a hedge fund. Those are all different domains. And usually, we even with the best intentions, think about, we'll read the Frankfurter Allgemeine and we'll write emails, but this is really not specific enough to really prepare your students for this domain. So we've been doing domain analysis work with our colleagues to have them really think first about, define the domain, and then be able to use reverse design model basically to create language for specific purposes courses. That's a definition of LSP. And we offer domain analysis training for our colleagues. So this is just what I described to you. And here are some of the current projects. Couple of existing courses, and these are courses in development. And these are now what we call domain analysis research groups or research cohorts. So, an interesting, for example, about this legal Spanish, a colleague in Spanish was asked by the law school actually to develop a course for legal Spanish and human rights law. She had designed a course, but she did a domain analysis. Fascinating finding. The knowledge, skills, and abilities were speaking ability, but also the legal work was looking at a questionnaire written in English, working with a Spanish-speaking client. So it meant you had to do a sight translation of the English questions, pose the question to your client. So that was the speaking part. You had to be able to comprehend their response, right? And write it in English. Because all these notes are going to someone in the law office that doesn't speak Spanish. You had to be able to read documents about the issues and other things going on. So that was the reading component. What she found was using Spanish in the human rights legal area does not need writing. So she didn't need to have writing as a component of her course. She could pull all that writing out. They don't write in Spanish in that work. So the domain analysis sometimes reveals surprising things about the domain that let you target the skills you need to be teaching. I can imagine a Hindi for finance course where you find out we don't read anything in Hindi about economics and business. We read all of the English language, Financial Times, whatever it is. There isn't that much journalism or whatever it is written in that language. So you don't need to teach them how to read, but you can focus on speaking, writing, listening, focusing on the skills. So that's what I mean about the domain analysis, revealing sometimes surprises about what working professionals in that domain need for the domain. We started doing cohorts. Last year, we had 2 groups in multiple languages, one doing domain analysis, language for study abroad. This would be an intermediate class, preparing students who are going to study abroad. It's slightly different language than they need to be taking the next sequence of a German class while still building their intermediate language skills. And language for translation studies. By language, I mean fill in the language. We had 4 or 5 different languages. This coming year, we're going to do 2 cohorts in economics. Economics is the single largest major in undergraduate college on our campus. There are about 1,800 kids in each year. And of those 1,800, 650 or so are economics majors. And we polled those students, and they are interested in language courses in economics, which at the University of Chicago is very theoretical, and business economics, which is a more practical course in the economics. So we will have 2 groups working this coming year on a domain analysis to identify the knowledge, skills, and abilities, and then design tests, and then design courses to attract those students back into our language programs. Questions? Yeah.
What specifically is happening with Latin for scholars?
Yeah, good question. Our classics colleague did a domain analysis of what students do with Latin when they come out of the language program and are taking courses with the faculty reading primary texts, because it really hasn't been defined. And he found out that they need to be able to read, obviously, actually read, not just translate, but read and translate. He also found they need meta language for grammar, because they need to talk about, when they're doing a close reading, they need to talk about the grammatical components that are engaged there. They also need listening comprehension, because they need to find their place in a text when someone's talking about a different chunk of the text. So what he was trying to do was saying, not with what we do in first and second year Latin and teaching them Latin, what other skills are we missing that they need when they transition into the upper level classes in scholarly discussion? And that's what he found. So ideally, he could go back and retool or realign his Latin classes. And that's exciting because it also has implications for a lot of the other ancient languages we teach on our campus. I don't know how many you teach here. We teach a lot of them. But it's going to shake the foundations of a few faculty members. That's another battle, conversation, discussion. Yeah, it's really interesting work. Yeah. Banu, yeah.
For example, for language for study abroad, so you have collected your analysis and created word-based or whatever you and you apply the same thing for every other language?
Different languages are finding different things. Yeah, they're finding different things. So it's not just word lists, it's also functions. Like, what do you need to, who are you going to be interacting with different in different cultures, host family, etc. Yeah, right. So at the moment, these are taught by language instructional professors, because no one in the economics department is going to be interested in teaching a Spanish course. I mean, we have a whole separate category of language across the curriculum courses. That's where they may come in, but these will potentially be taught by our language instructional colleagues. One caveat, not every single department is on board with this. We still have departments that say, language departments that say, you're not allowed to teach that because you're not allowed to teach content, which makes me want to jump out of my window, but I don't. But it's going to be a battle. But I'm going to use these first 6 slides of this presentation with these departments to say, look, we have students we're missing that could be in our classes. We know that they want to take classes in that will prepare them for the workplace. We want to design them and we want to teach them, but it's going to be a battle in some departments, not all departments, some departments. It's a good question. Yeah.
I'm so curious about the difference. I think the difference or similarities of where what one goes inside another between domain analysis and needs analysis.
Yeah.
Domain analysis part of needs analysis.
It's the other way around. So talking to the students will be part of a domain analysis.
Domain
Is bigger. So for example, for a domain analysis for business economics, you might talk to people in the business school. You might look at job descriptions. You might look at textbooks for that domain. You might talk to people working in banks that actually have jobs, or talk to the people hiring those people. And you might also talk to students and say, what do you think you need? But the students don't always know what they need to work in the domain because they're not in the domain. They're sitting in the classroom. So the needs analysis is a subset of the domain analysis. The domain analysis components are it's really a research project because you collect a lot of data which has to be coded and analyzed statistically, and that's how you build an argument for the description of your domain.
Right? I mean, you are not trained.
Of course you're not. Of course I'm not. I'm not trained in medicine either, but think of how many colleagues designing those courses and what are they based on. So really my colleague Ahmed, who's the assessment specialist in the Language Center, he presented a keynote at the ISLSP last spring, the International Symposium on LSP classes, and really presented, and there were a lot of people, there were 200 people at that meeting, and many people who have been working in LSP for decades. He's really presenting a research basis for the design of LSP classes. Now, there are, for example, in the German program, they have a 3rd-year class called, like it's for the Arbeitskultur, German for the working culture. That's a theme-based course or a sort of a content-based course to prepare students in that content area, but it's not really preparing them to work in a profession. So these are really specifically designed to prepare them to step into that profession or that professional domain and function.
And domain analysis then is for language.
We are using domain analysis as a starting point because we use this model. There's no description. There are few research descriptions of the domain. So we're starting here, and if you start here, you have to first define the domain. Yeah, for the language. Another example, and Baumann has worked in this area. So many of our institutions have these graduate reading requirements. You must be able to read secondary literature in another research language, right? Okay, what's the domain for that skill? Where's the domain? What is it? It's the library. Or, I mean, they don't go to the library anymore, they download from the computer, but it's the world of secondary literature. That's that domain. That's a different domain from economics. And my colleague Ahmed researched that domain and listed the skills. What do people need to be able to do with that secondary literature? And what did he find out? That first of all, they don't need to translate 600 words. No one does that. They need to be able to read an article, scan it, decide, do I need it for my, you've all done this. You scan an article, do I need this for my research? Yes. You read it carefully. You extract knowledge from it and integrate it with your work. And then you might need to take 2 or 3 lines and cite it or quote it and translate those. That's what our test looks like. And that's how we've designed our classes, to prepare learners to do that. So that's another example of a domain, defining a domain, designing a test, designing a course. Finally, I have 2 minutes, right? 1? Okay. So we've been doing this work in 2 different projects. The first was a grant from the Mellon Foundation in 2016 called the Mellon Transforming Language Instruction Project, where we invite groups and pairs and cohorts to our campus to be taught, trained how to do this work. Everyone does anyone who's not ACTFL trained does ACTFL training. That's why I started with redefining proficiency. This is not to smash you into some proficiency mold. This is so when I say intermediate high reading, you know what that means. Or if I say novice low or novice high writing, everyone in the room knows what that means. It's a way to communicate about skills. That's all it is. Then we do, our colleagues design proficiency tests, 4 skills tests for their language, end of first year, end of second year, whatever you need. We're very, very hands-on about that test design because many people, myself included to a certain extent, have not had a lot of training in assessment. We're very hands-on on the test design. And then once the test is in place, again, this is basically reverse design. Once your test is in place, you can come back another summer and do a curriculum workshop and start redesigning or realigning your curriculum. What we found is that as people are doing the test design, they're already thinking, wow, I'm not doing enough authentic listening, or gee, all my writing assignments are things that they would never do in the real world. I need to have them writing emails and writing, letters to the editor, or writing a note to your host parent, or whatever it might be. So we have 1 more full year of these workshops. I have descriptions of them here and dates, and I'll share this with Angelica. If a cohort from Cornell would like to come, and actually I'd like to have Angelica come so she could actually be teaching this to you instead of to rely on us teaching teaching it to all of you. And that's what we've actually done with several institutions. Just last summer from Vanderbilt, we had 4 instructors of Lichtels and the center director from Vanderbilt come and all do the workshop together. And we hope they go back and bring it to their campus. So this is a invitation in a way. If you'd like to apply, if you'd like to get a cohort together, we offer this in 2 ways. One is 2 instructors of Lichtels, especially on 2 different campuses. All right, so if I'm the single instructor of Haitian Creole on my campus, and Gunhild is teaching Haitian Creole at the University of Iowa, we work together to create tests and share curriculum and possibly even share students, although that has fallen into sort of the background. Or a group of 4 instructors from one campus who are going to learn all this and then take it back to their campus and be like a cohort of experts, as we call it. So like I said, we have funding for 1 more year for sure. You may know that Mellon has pivoted. Mellon used to be the only foundation in the country that was 100% dedicated to supporting the humanities. And we got our grant from them in 2016, a very generous grant. We're spending it out now. They have pivoted to DEI. I'll say on the record, and I know it's being recorded, a little bit of performative DEI, but I have trying to make a case with Mellon that the less commonly taught language groups that we work with are a whole bunch of people without access to a lot of professional development. They're under-resourced languages and sometimes under-resourced instructors, and also very often, especially the heritage group, first generation and other international students. And the DEI that Mellon is doing pertains to these groups. So that's how we're going to pitch another grant to Mellon. So stay tuned. We'll see if we get that funding. Okay. think that's it. Yes. Thank you. Questions, comments, and I'm a little bit late, but we're good. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. Questions? Yeah.
Hi, I wanted to ask the question about lictals. As you know, we don't always have the privilege to sort of have two different tracks, one for heritage and non-heritage.
Yeah, I know. Small
Yeah.
enrollments. Yeah, I know.
Yes, and that's a very different, difficult balance to have,
Yes.
either pulling the heritage language learner skills at a lower level just to match with the completely new.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. I hope that we are going to develop more lictal, what we call, I think they're called building foundational skills classes that would be available to heritage learners all over the country. We designed them as online classes. They're online classes taught virtually. They have a synchronous component, but because so much of the work is on reading and writing, review of grammar, and like this precision of the vocabulary and grammar, a lot of that can happen individually. So we would like to maybe be offering those to many learners. I mean, the other way with your own curriculum is if you can offer, I don't know if you can split them just for the autumn and get we've had a couple cases where I think it was in Korean, she had a small group in her heritage class. 2 or 3 of them went into the second year sequence. One of them sprang into the third year, because they have such different profiles. But no, I agree with you. It's, I apologize in a way if I painted a very simplistic, oh, just do this, it's all taken care of, because I know those challenges persist and they have such different profiles. But I do think that the outcomes can still be useful. You may also have two different sets of outcomes, one for your heritage learners and one for your traditional learners, and still be able to accommodate both in one class, especially if they're within one proficiency level, but at different sub-levels, there can be ways to accommodate those learners, but it is challenging. I've never had to teach them, so I'm innocent of that hard work. Yeah. Other questions?
I feel I'm asking too many questions, but
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to know your perspective on, because that might be personal, and I think it's where I sometimes might struggle a little more about the syllabus, whether it's a synthetic syllabus or analytic syllabus. Is that something like you will orient them as well, like whereas what comes first, right? Whether the forms come first, or whether you approach more. Is that something that comes within the model, or?
I mean, when it comes to curriculum design, we really fold it back to the instructors. You are making those choices, but making them knowing what's going on here. So we're very hands off on syllabus design, and then but really encouraging people to give their proficiency assessments as cumulative exams at the end of a year to really see what's going on. Now, one thing the proficiency, or I guess 2 things the proficiency assessments don't capture is content knowledge, because proficiency has never been a test of content knowledge. And secondly is cultural learning. That is always going to be a shortcoming in that world. But if you can define that yourself, and good luck defining the cultural part, if you solve that problem, you can retire. Defining culture and testing it and seeing, how your students perform. But really, that I don't have any point of view on type of syllabus. I know how I would design language classes, but that we leave very much up to the individual instructors. There's no methodological approach that we come up on one side or the other. Other questions, comments, disagreements? Yeah. There's our. Nice
Hi,
to see
Kathy.
you.
Nice to see you. Thank you very much for your inspiring talk all the time. And I have like a personal struggles. The first one is that I'm teaching the elementary Korean with like a different instructors, like a team teaching. So we have 4 sections. So I was afraid that if the one instructor teaches whole one section, like a different sections, then then at the end of the semester or in a year, the students' proficiency level will be different. So that's why that I just we decide to teach all 4 sections like a day by day.
Yeah.
But just in case we increase one more section, then it will be 5 hours in a row in a day. Then it will be really challenging. So I was just wondering that how to solve this kind of problem. And the second one is that I have we are very grateful that we have different tracks for heritage and non-heritage track. But even for the elementary heritage track, some students after taking the online placement test, I cannot place the person in either track.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So for example, a student can speak Korean very well, but he doesn't, the student doesn't even know the alphabet. Yeah, cannot read or write at all.
Yeah.
So it's very, very sad that I had to turn the student down, that I cannot place you.
Yeah.
So what will be the a solution for that?
Yeah. I don't know. No. I mean, the one thing that comes to mind with a student like that, and maybe others, if there's some kind of online self-paced delivery of just the writing system, because it seems like with so much oral proficiency, I don't know where their reading is. Can they read the language? No. Okay. So just some kind of self-paced delivery of the writing system and some elementary reading to bring them to a point where you could see where they could enter your curriculum, maybe. But that have to be something they'd have to commit to in the summer or on their own if they want to join you, right? Because they're all. I mean, this is the conundrum of the heritage. There's so many, almost infinite profiles, right? The other thing about your four sections. I mean, I don't know. Is everyone on the same page, sort of methodologically? No. Okay. So again, yeah. So I think when you have that going on, everybody has to come together and you have to teach them what you're doing and why you're doing it. You have to show them, give them some proficiency training, teach them what an intermediate low is, tell them these are my goals, show them the test, have them take the test so they understand the test, and say at the end of the year, every single student is going to get this test. And this is why we suggest teaching this way. This is why we suggest these kinds of activities. We had this in one of our programs, actually, it happened to be an East Asian language. Someone's class was underperforming like a whole sub-level across all 4 skills. And it was right there in the data. It was nothing personal. It was what are you doing? What's happening? Your students are not hitting the mark, and then it became an intervention with the teaching. So I think teaching, even the TAs, they need to understand why they're being asked to do something in the way they're being asked to do it. They need to understand that. It's a great lesson in language pedagogy, but to make it clear, it's going to come out in the wash at the end. We're going to see it based on a very well designed test, and then you see it. And that's a lesson for everyone. So, because people will, I mean, we have programs that have very, very prescriptive day-to-day, literally minute-by-minute lesson plans. And that's what their graduate students use. But, the graduate students are not learning to teach, because learning to teach is not doing what you're told. Learning to teach is looking at something and deciding what to do based on what you know about teaching. So it's really not helping them ultimately. Yeah. Yeah. Any Zoom questions? No. Okay.
Well, Kathy, thank you so much
You are
for
very
this.
welcome. My
Lots of
pleasure.
food for thought. We'll revamp everything. We start from scratch. Well, actually, we start in the back, right? Not from
Start at the end.
Yeah.
Yes.
We don't start at the beginning, but at the end.
That's right. Good conversations.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, both in person and online. And please help me one more time in thanking Dr.
You're
Catherine
so welcome.
Baumann.
My pleasure. Thank you.